Hi, Matt.
Hey Graham, nice to see you.
Nice to see you again. This is the Crazy in Love podcast. We are talking today about love as a foreign language, the idea that being in love, being in a decent relationship is akin or analogous to learning and cultivating foreign language skills. Why don't you kick us off, Matt, by talking about where you come at this issue from, the idea that relationship skills are something we need to learn and practice over our lifetimes?
Yeah, so I think we're saying that a good relationship is not rocket science, but for some of us who haven't had a great example of what a good relationship might look like in our growing up, that actually you are learning this almost from scratch. And the kind of example that you and I have been kicking around a bit was we lived with a lovely Swedish au pair, and her English, as her brother's English and Swedish friend's English, is immaculate. It's just stunningly good, flawless. And we were wondering why that is. And there's a really obvious reason for that. It's because kids in Sweden learn to speak English. They learn it from the first year in their primary education. It's compulsory throughout their second education. And what do you know? They're good at it at the end of that. Then kids in the UK, kids in the US who don't learn any Swedish can't speak Swedish. And it will seem very, very difficult to pick that up at age 20, 21, or whenever we sort of typically start to get into serious relationships. So that's the analogy or comparison, really. If you've not learned that, if you're not steeped in relationships, how to resolve conflict, how to take turns, how to compromise, actually, when you get into something serious, it becomes quite overwhelming, quite difficult to manage.
And maybe towards the back end of this conversation, we can go through some of those skills in a bit more detail about what
Yeah, good
we
idea.
would advocate people kind of take seriously, or even if we are thinking about kind of developing a curriculum of sorts for people to learn what that would look like. But I guess there's something in that analogy around if you grow up in a certain type of household, you might be taught the language of relationships in a certain way that you might grow up and not question and take some of that learning into your future adult relationships, right?
Yeah, I think it's it's less like, just to be sort of precise on the terminology, I suppose for
Yeah.
me it's observing and then that kind of learned behavior. So something that you see and observe and then you imitate in some way, shape, or form. So it's not necessarily so much so about lessons or being taught. It's more something you absorb and you see around you and it becomes habituated. So the obvious example is in something like conflict management, and whether you see your parents step through that in a way that is open and transparent, takes on board the other person's preference and point of view, stays calm, looks to find a solution to that, and everything is fine, right? Don't necessarily need to see everything in exactly the same way, but need to find some kind of amicable solution, a compromise, or an ability to take turns, or whatever it might be. And the opposite of that is you watch parents either avoid those things, like refuse to discuss them, or become very aggressive and heated when they do so. And that over and over again on a daily basis, sometimes almost an hourly basis, right, over a series of weeks, months, and then years, has a massive impact on how you then handle yourself in relationships with friends, relationships with authority figures, and most of all, we're thinking about romantic relationships because that tends to be where the sharpest feelings show up.
Yeah. So one classic example I see with couples of something along those lines is one member of a couple, one of the partners finding arguments very, very overwhelming and very, very threatening. So as soon as one partner raises their voice or says something pretty dramatic in an argument, they decompensate a bit. They go to pieces. They fall apart. They think the relationship is over, and trying to rebuild trust from that place when the other person is just saying, "Well, we just had an argument. Don't worry about it. We can wake up the next day. We can say sorry. We can pick the pieces up. We can have a bit of sex and move on, and everything's rosy." Do you see something similar?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I recognize that pattern entirely, and recognize it the other way around as well, where somebody, I don't know, flies off the handle because something can't be discussed in a calm way. You see it both ways around, don't you? I think you see the person who is really set back by those things, the person who thinks that's just an ordinary way to resolve conflict. Kind of sometimes there's a fury with the other person who won't come at you, who won't tell you what they're really thinking, who won't enter into an argument, and both parties think they're right. One person thinks, it's better to avoid those things. In this extreme example we're talking about, the other person thinks you should always argue it out. You should stay up till 2 a.m. until the conflict is resolved.
Yeah, maybe this is one of those areas where the analogy of foreign languages gets a little bit less tight, in the sense that with the foreign language there is usually one correct way
Yeah.
of saying something, whereas a lot of what we say about relationships is often about difference. Yes, there's obvious no-nos, like don't be disrespectful, don't be name calling, try to avoid things like saying always and never. When you
Yeah.
fall into those patterns, you're likely to
Those
be,
are really good things to pause on, though, because I think
yeah,
those are sort of rules of grammar, aren't they? If we were sticking
yeah,
with the analogy
yeah,
of a foreign language, it's like it does follow some conventions, and just like English is a bit of a muddle, isn't it? There aren't consistent rules for it. You can remember most of them. There are applicable rules, and
yeah.
it does conform to, albeit a bit of a sort of eccentric way of holding together. It does hold together, and I think relationships are a bit like that. Those are good examples you pick on. So what I hear in the situation you're describing is somebody saying he always does, he never does that.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things, and it's like that is just unlikely to be true. That is unlikely to be accurate. And what it then elicits in the other person, of course, is a defensive reaction, which is, well, that's not true, because I do sometimes do it. Just the other week, I did the very thing that you've accused me of not doing. And we're now rowing about dates and times and whether it was Tuesday or Wednesday, rather than I wanted to talk about something specific. I wanted to raise the fact that when we were out with your friends, I felt like you dismissed me, or you diminished me, or you put me down, or you know, and that would be worth talking about, because the other person might then hear that. But if they get told they always do something or they never do a thing, they're going to come out fighting, or they're going to do the opposite. They're going to go to their corner and sulk and feel like the whole thing's unfair,
Mm.
rather than focus in on that particular evening when maybe they were a little rude or dismissive of their partner. It would be worth catching that and talking about that and making a plan to do something differently.
Good. How much of this, in your experience, plays into attachment styles and attachment theory? We're obviously both trained in that aspect of the work and that aspect of the research, and I think both of us have a slightly ambiguous relationship with attachment theory. I think it can be really helpful as a frame to talk about how people respond in adult relationships and how what they've learned from the past can influence how they are in adult relationships. But I think both of us also think that it boxes people too neatly into categories and creates a kind of an additional identity marker that can often be unhelpful and quite limiting, and can lead to defensive responses in relationships rather than more of that kind of fluid response that we're advocating and you're talking about just now.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I think it's broadly useful, isn't it? I see lots of clients who are attracted to that, and I think come to me because of my associations with the Bowlby Centre in particular and attachment
Yeah.
theory generally. It's common parlance, isn't it, to think of ourselves as anxiously attached or avoidant, and I think people know that terminology. They know that they are aiming towards being securely attached, or they wish they were, or they want to find ways back to that. So I think that bit of it is helpful. I think it can be a bit reductive in the end, the idea that we're
Mm.
all one of 2 3 4 categories, however you divide it. Some attachment researchers end up sort of doubling that number, and then it all gets a bit out of hand, I think, doesn't it? But broadly, as a framework, I think it's helpful to think in those terms. I think what you lose in that is the specifics of your family, what it was like for you to hear dad raising his voice, or for you to see mum doing XYZ, how that translates for you, and how that looks now in your relationship. That's the bit that I think is maybe a little less helpful, and that's the bit that I think is sometimes worth coming to therapy for, because you've got very particular circumstances. You are shaped by the events of your past. How could you not be? And they are then shaped again by the person that you're in a relationship with. So I think some of the advice that we would give out that tends to hold for most circumstances does also sometimes need to be tailored to fit exactly where you're at.
Yeah, agreed. I think one of the aspects of couples therapy that people are surprised about is that you might, with each individual partner, go into a bit of depth on what it was like growing up in their household, both for that individual to understand, but also for the partner to understand the context of Okay, I hadn't quite appreciated that your dad would respond in that way, or your mum would respond in a different way, and that has shaped how you expect me to respond in a similar situation in our relationship. That when I do raise my voice ever so slightly, it can evoke some of these feelings of what it was like when your dad would raise his voice and how terrifying that might be. Those kind of dynamics that play themselves out that I think couples don't often anticipate having in couples therapy. They think that you're going to talk just about the here and now, relationship skills, how to defuse an argument, how to make sure difference in the relationship is navigated between the two of them.
Yeah, it's both, isn't it? I think it's for me, they're two sides of the same coin. You know, we freak out, flip out in the way that we do because there are events in our past that I think, you know, predispose us to that. I think there's a genetic component as well, isn't there? There's a bit of personality and character in there. There's a bit of biology, and there's also some lessons that we've absorbed, and there's some things that we've seen that have just gone wonky that we don't yet realize. It feels to me like it is really well worth knowing those things about your partner. I don't think you need to know them in every last level of detail. I don't think my wife entirely understands my growing up, and I suspect I don't entirely understand hers, but we know when we've got conflict. So I don't know, we want something from the school. We feel like our son's not necessarily being prioritized or something along those lines. We've got a very different problem solving style. I want to get in there. I'm a lot of heat, and I want the situation resolved yesterday, and she's much more peaceful, much more of a bridge builder, much more collaborative, got much more sense of the long term. We've got more school years left with our eldest son, for example, and more to come with our youngest son. We're not serious about changing school, so let's see what we can do. And when we get that right, I'm bringing my bit of heat and my advocacy. She's bringing her diplomacy, and it works really well. But what could happen in that situation, and in different situations has happened in the past, is we clash. You're not advocating strongly enough. You don't see this the way I do. You don't care. You're a hothead. You know, those kind of things where we're at our worst, where couples are at their worst, making accusations and kind of counter
Yeah.
claiming one another rather than hang on. We're seeing this really differently. What's going on? Let's
Yeah.
just pause for a second. We're getting lost in this. We've started having a massive go at one another when what we're trying to do is, you know, solve a problem elsewhere.
Yeah, you just really neatly described one of the two ways of a kind of English tourist abroad I was thinking about before this conversation. If we don't speak the foreign language, what are the traps that we tend to fall into? One is we say the thing slowly and more loudly and hope that that's gonna lead to the other person understanding it. So I think the kind of heated argument is a kind of analogy for that. It's the sense of, well, if I just shout louder and say it in a more aggressive and more universal tone, I'm going to be heard this time, when it's likely actually that that's going to be met with a very, very defensive response. The other way, of course, that we respond is we kind of pretend we understand what the other person is saying. So we kind of get overwhelmed by this speed of which the Spanish waiter is speaking to us, and we think, oh God, I don't know what he's saying, so I'll just point at something on the menu. And I think that's what can happen in relationships as well, is that two people know that they're quite different, but instead of really exploring those differences and taking those differences seriously, they almost try and avoid them, sweep them under the carpet, and then they raise their ugly head in slightly quieter ways, potentially. Burning resentment is a kind of classic.
Yeah.
I think unspoken, sulking resentment that can really eat away at a relationship over time. And I just wanted to highlight that potential, as well as the more heated kind of intensity of misunderstanding.
Yeah, no, it's a really good example. You know, makes complete sense to me. I was thinking just about sort of slight divert maybe, but I was thinking about how we grow up and what we see around us. We see our parents when they're in the midst of family life. We don't see the courtship bit. We
Yes.
see them when they're paying bills, right? When they're probably
Not sure we want to see the courtship bit, though, do we?
we see them in the rush hour of their lives, don't we? We see
Freud would say that we were desperate to see it, but
we see them like battling those things, you know, in the most, you know, maybe in the most stressed and strained, difficult bit of life. And I think even in relationships which on the surface look pretty good and feel collaborative, how much affection we see, how much kind of time for one another, how much admiring of one another, how much kind of playfulness and all of that, you know, good stuff that we see growing up, the things that we might aspire to in our relationship. I think those have sometimes gone missing for, you know, fairly understandable reason. So if it's a sort of monkey see, monkey do thing, we don't often see that side of life. And I think that can cause problems as well. So when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking of families in which there's conflict and in which it's difficult for the child to grow up. They get caught in the crossfire. But I'm also thinking of just ordinary relationships where parents are just really, really busy.
Yeah. Yeah. And the actual the foundations of that relationship and the work that they put in, positive, really, really fun work from time to time, but the children might not see that aspect of it. What goes on around the dinner table once the kids are in bed, but the couple are eating dinner at 9, 10 o'clock at night, looking back on the day, holding hands, having a chat about the day, whatever that might be. They don't get to see that bit of it, so they
Yeah,
don't
I
necessarily
think,
need to absorb those lessons.
and I think sometimes it's not there. It's
Yeah.
gone. It's been swamped by other stuff. There's some data from the US, fairly recent data about the number of couples who are married or cohabiting who report showing daily physical affection for the other, and it's just over half of those couples. Just a lot of missing, isn't it? It's a lot of times that isn't in place, that
And
isn't
that
in.
presumably just means like a hug or something,
Oh,
right?
sure.
Holding
Yeah.
hands rather than anything more intense than that.
No, 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 not at all. No, it's not a question about sex. It's about
Yeah.
like small acts of physical affection on a daily basis. Basically, hugging and kissing is the shorthand
Mm.
for just a bit of touch. As you kind of move past one another in a house, rather than moving past one
Mm.
another, strangers or people transacting a bunch of tasks. And it can feel like that sometimes, can't it? I mean, it's
Sure.
really busy. I think the family life, and particularly you and I coming out of those earlier years, aren't we? But those early years, I think there's an intensity to it. You're always wiping someone's ass or clearing up some kind of
Yeah.
spill.
Yeah. Careful though, Matt. Having mentioned your Swedish au pair already, this podcast thing, you've got limited sympathy from the listeners about how tough your child rearing days were.
It's fair enough. Yeah, yeah.
Part of the article we've just written for Psychology Today about all of this does at the end of it list out a few of those rules of grammar,
Yeah,
right? Things that
yeah.
things that we think are genuine principles of good relationships, that whatever language you have learned, whatever you have seen in your childhood's home, it's pretty good to try and work on these rules in your adult relationships. Let's just go through a few of those just to kind of finish up on some things, some practical things that listeners might do and work on, take away from this chat.
Yeah, good idea. Because I think you've seen good and bad, haven't you? That's sort of
Yeah.
how we segue into this. You're if you've been one of the lucky ones who've seen nothing but love and harmony, great, good for you. This article's probably not for you, but if you've seen a mix or you've seen the other side of it, then you might want to just think through almost from first principles what those rules, what those kind of preconditions are. So we had 7 of them. The first one of which is just the importance of complimenting your partner, appreciating them, recognizing what they do for you, big and small. You're trying to create a kind of almost like a savings account. It's the Gottman's work, isn't it? I think that kind of ratio of 5 to 1. 5 to 1 compliments before you make a withdrawal, either a request or offer a bit of feedback into the relationship, which is a bit more challenging. So 5 compliments about your person you're with, how good they look today, that they look really good in that particular color, that their hair looks great, that you're really grateful for the cup of tea, that you admire how they are with their friends or their family, or whatever it is. And I think we're still there only up to 4, aren't we? Quite a challenge. When I put that to couples in my work, it's like, wow, that feels like a lot. We've got to get 5 before we can get to 1. But it would sort of be a principle of financial management. If you're doing it the other way around, you're in big trouble quick, aren't you? If you keep making withdrawals, or the quantum of the withdrawal is much greater than the bit of investment that you're putting in. And I think it does, that sort of algebra does follow through for relationships too. There is something sort of and hard about that. Like you're going to need to be investing and doing some good stuff if you want to be able to draw on that and have a good and comfortable, harmonious relationship. So that's the first one, really. Make sure you're complimenting, expressing gratitude, showing appreciation. And then if if I'll just carry on whizzing through and you'll jump in maybe.
Plow on.
if you want to raise something, when you do want to raise something, it is worth thinking about the best way to do that, the best time, the best manner. So we've said something like use tact and diplomacy, which isn't necessarily what you always hear in couples relationships. You need to express your truth and all of them, but there is something about just being thoughtful about when and how you make those requests and the manner in which you make them. So I would like it if, rather than you never do this, which
Mm.
we talking a bit about it before. And it's say what you want, but don't demand it, right? There's no ultimatum. So it's something like I'd appreciate it if versus if you carry on like that, we're done, we're through, we're finished, you can put it in a more measured way. And where the temptation or the pull, the tendency is to make a complaint, that needs to be converted into a request. So the complaint would be something like, all you ever do these days is work. But the request is, I'd like it if you could come home early one day this week, if that's possible, so that we could grab dinner out or we can make something at home, just sort of quite simple stuff. Some of this is simple to say and hard to do, but
Yes.
those are where the
I think the only thing I'd add on that one last one is around. I work with couples where we're trying to frame a lot of their challenges in the collective. So trying to see the challenge as a shared challenge. So the challenge in that last example is you've got one person working really long hours. So that person might really enjoy their work. They might have to work long hours. They might not have a choice most of the time. They might need to earn a certain wage, whatever it might be. That in some sense is a shared problem. So, okay, I don't imagine you want to be at the office till X o'clock every night. Is there one day that we can identify together that you could come home rather than the finger of blame? As soon as the finger of blame comes out, you're in a problematic place. It's not going to work.
Absolutely, and there's a really obvious counter to that or response, isn't there? If you say to me, "I'd really like for us to go out for dinner one night this week," you're working really hard at the moment. Can you come back? Would that work for you? I can say, do you know what? I'm absolutely snowed. I just need to get this done. We're in the midst of a whatever it is, right?
Yeah,
Some
yeah.
kind of thing that just sometimes does keep you at work, and it's going to look different in another week's time, or come the end of the month, or give me another fortnight. Or at the moment, what I really need is to be full on into that. And then you're into a negotiation, aren't you? Do you want to be with somebody like that? Do you admire their ability to stick to a task? Do you like their ability to generate income and, do impressive things in the world? Or is that not so much for you? Like, actually, you're feeling neglected, you're feeling alone. We've got different priorities. It would lead to a constructive conversation, even if it wasn't a delightful one that resulted in instant agreement.
Good.
And then when you're on the receiving end, I suppose, to your point, it's sort of something we're trying to do together as a couple. Like, what do you do when you're on the receiving end of those complaints, feedback, requests, whatever we might think of them as? And I guess priority number one is try not to be defensive, and that's pretty hard, isn't it? That sort of includes for me shutting down and zoning out as well. Can you see it from their point of view? If you bite your lip at work in an important client meeting or with your boss, can you listen to your partner? Can you can you stay stum? Can you not interrupt them? Can you hear what they're saying? Can you try and get the gist of that? And can you try and draw out where there are points of agreement? So in the example we've been talking about, could you say, you're right, I have been preoccupied with work lately? Because if you said that, most instances when I'm with couples, I say to them, if he or she were to say that in that way, would that make a difference? And the answer I get almost 10 times out of 10 is that absolutely. I'm not an idiot. I understand, as long as I'm spoken to in a, respectful way and I'm treated with courtesy, you're right. Accept that point of view, you're onto something, but I can't change it at the moment. That's fatal.
Yeah, and in that way, you're not just signaling that you agree. You're signaling that you want to see them as well.
Yeah,
That
sure. Well,
you
you
see
can
it
go
as an
much further,
obstacle as
can't you?
well.
You're right. You
Yeah,
can go further. You can say, like, I miss that as well, And
yeah,
I think complaints that we never have sex anymore, or we don't make time for this. It's like you can meet that with I miss it too. I think
yeah.
that's, I miss it too. Like, I want to do something about that, and it might need to wait a little while longer. Or you're right. Do you know what? That is more important, and we do need a long weekend, or we do need to prioritize whatever it might be.
Yeah, because so many of the difficulties I see in couples are when one party doesn't feel held in mind, doesn't feel thought about. And if you can communicate even in your own style, yeah, I'm thinking about this too. I might not say it as much as you, I might not show it as much as you, but I'm missing these times too. And I agree that we need to work on this together, I think is a valuable way forward.
So it's a bit cheesy, but so often I find couples are saying the same thing. They're just
Yeah,
saying it, the other way around, and
spot
they're,
on.
they're both longing for the same thing, aren't they? Which is never really very far from, do you appreciate me? Do you still like me? Do you want to be with me? Do you take pleasure in my company? Are we having any fun? Is this nice? Do you still find things about me, desirable and attractive and impressive? And it's something along those lines. Sometimes it's masked in all sorts of things, doesn't help out around the house, always at work late, spend time with their friends. But it's really the complaint at the meta level is something about, I feel underappreciated, not
Yeah,
heard, those kinds of things.
good.
And then the next one is yours, which is take a break during heated discussions, really. I think the thing that you said to me a few weeks back, kind of crappy advice, really, isn't it? To never go to sleep on an argument. Sometimes, that's exactly what you need to do. You need to let cooler heads prevail. If it's 2 a.m., it's almost certainly the wrong time to be discussing this. Like, schedule half an hour tomorrow, pick it up then. It's as simple as
Yeah,
that.
I'd extrapolate that to arguments more generally. I work with a number of people or couples where one person is really struggles with emotional regulation in an argument.
Yep.
They get way too heated, occasionally quite physical in arguments. Step away, step away, step away at that point. It's the best thing you can do for everyone involved. And if it takes you 2 days to come back to that conversation until you're in a place where you can talk about it more logically, more rationally, do it.
Yeah.
100%.
I agree. I guess just because you've kind of introduced that kind of element of, when things become physical, you're not thinking of, I suppose, domestic violence as you and I might know that from our government days, but more someone slamming a door, perhaps.
Slamming a door or giving a gentle push away as they kind of move through the room to get away. They're feeling like they're pinned into a corner, almost literally in a conversation, and they sort of give a slight push out the door. Obviously unacceptable and inappropriate to a large degree, but can have quite a big ripple in the relationship as soon as anything approaches physicality in any way whatsoever.
Yeah,
So when anything like that is in the room, I suggest get out of the room.
yeah.
Get out.
I've got sort of a real allergy to that kind of stuff. I think of what Marsha Linehan said, anger, and in her kind of method of therapy, she's just like, cut it out,
Cut it out. Yeah.
and that's my stance on those things. Like, I don't want to work with it. It's not. It might be for others. It's not for me. And I'm impatient and intolerant to that kind of stuff. Having been a bit around it as well, it's just anyway, so maybe the final two quickly.
Yeah.
Retire the drama. It's easier said than done, isn't it? But linking from what we're just talking about, like avoiding things like always and never, avoiding those exaggerations, avoiding criticism, contempt, avoiding kind of character assassinations. Basically, stop catastrophizing. It's okay to disagree. Good communication isn't that we agree on everything. We can agree to disagree. It's not the end of the world. And relationships are about give and take, right? So just something kind of level-headed, something realistic, something closer to thinking in terms of like good enough. Is it good enough rather than is it perfect? And all of sometimes the weight that goes with that, the drama,
There's something in there about picking your battles, isn't there? That in relationships are a constant balance between two people's differences, and some of those differences you need to learn to accept. Some of those differences are so intolerable time to time that you need to find a way to communicate that and try and work towards some sort of conciliation there around those differences, some sort of change, whatever it might be. But I think a lot of couples get into that horrible routine of picking away at those differences. So all the differences become problematic. All the differences become a reason to complain and whine. Because in effect, what you're saying to the other person is, I want you to be like me. I want you to be exactly the same personality as me. I want you to order the world and structure the world and think about the world in exactly the same way as me. But that's not a healthy relationship. That's fundamentally quite a narcissistic one.
Yeah, no, agreed. And I think sometimes where that drama, particularly where it tips over and there is door slamming and the kind of examples you've given, like that is if there isn't a genuine recognition of that, the final point is say sorry, when you've done
Yeah.
something that's worth apologizing for. If that isn't on the table or isn't part of the conversation, I think that is the sort of, potentially and sometimes certainly the walk away point, right? There might be somebody who's got something to do around emotional regulation and anger management, and that bit probably isn't sitting with you and me talking about enhanced communication skills. It can help, right? But if somebody's really committed to that stance that it's ordinary or there's just like that's just the way it goes, that's the point at which I think this is unlikely to work, and you've got bigger.
Yeah, if you're just saying this is me, learn to live with it. You see that a lot, don't you? Well, there's something about understanding what a really good apology looks like. We don't have time to go
Yeah,
into that in depth today, but there's something about acknowledging what they're apologizing for that's really important within that, so that the other person gets some sort of recognition as to it's not just a set of words of I'm sorry that just draws a line under it. It's something meaningful where the person has done some sort of reflection on their behavior and is apologizing for the specific hurt that they've caused.
I agree, and not to contradict what you're saying, but I think the other side of that is you can keep it brief. It
Yeah.
can be, you don't have to over explain. You don't have to go into victim mode. Don't have to do a lengthy post mortem all the time. Reset, do the next right thing is often a helpful way through it. And we say in this house to my boys, sorry means you won't do it again. It's kind of like I want to see that happening. So I'm always a bit skeptical when there are great sorries being issued. It's like, well, let's see whether the door is slammed again the following week. Let's see whether discourteous behavior when one person stays out late, having agreed to text and keep in touch and then doesn't. Let's see if that changes. Let's see if there's any movement on that. Let's see if we can turn these things down rather than I did it and I'm sorry, I did it and I'm sorry, I did it and I'm sorry. It's like that isn't quite cutting the mustard. So I agree with you. There's something about recognizing it, isn't there? Being precise, accurate about what you're apologizing for, seeing it from the other person's point
Yeah.
of view, but
But
also,
I'm with you. Okay, the power of just occasionally saying sorry, I was a dick
yeah,
is how many people get that very often in their lives. There's someone important to them saying, you know what, I own it.
yeah, yeah.
Totally get it. Won't happen again. Let's move on.
Yeah. I've been staying at work. I've been prioritizing that. I've been a bit thoughtless. You're right. I haven't done X, Y, Z. You're right. I did used to do those things, and I used to like doing them. And you valued them, and I don't know where that went. I'm at fault. I'm going to do something differently.
Great. Any last thoughts?
No, I think that's more than enough of us burbling on, isn't it?
You got any Swedish phrases to leave us with before we?
No, that would have been good, wouldn't it?
You
Yeah.
didn't even take the opportunity to learn any Swedish.
No.
Shame on you.
Good
All right, Matt. Thanks very much.
to
See you
see you.
soon.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye.